first get to the White House, preparing to defend President Trump's emergency declaration. Several Republicans have expressed their disagreement and may be forced to vote on it, as Democrats are reportedly preparing a joint resolution of disapproval to repeal it when Congress returns, a move that senior Trump advisor Stephen Miller says will not stand.
If they pass a resolution of disapproval, will the president veto that, which would be the first veto of his presidency?
Well, obviously, the president is going to protect his national emergency declaration, Chris.
Right. So, yes, he will veto?
He's going to protect his national emergency declaration, guaranteed.
And here is more of Stephen Miller being questioned by Fox News' Chris Wallace.
I know that you are a constitutional conservative and you believe the Constitution should be interpreted as written, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Here's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the Constitution as written. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Isn't what President Trump wants to do a clear violation of what the founders, of what James Madison talked about as giving Congress the power of the purse?
No, because Congress in 1976 passed the National Emergencies Act and gave the president the authority, as a result of that, to invoke a national emergency in many different circumstances, but among them for the use of military construction funds. And that was the point I was making earlier, is that if the president were to say we're going to use military construction funds to, say, increase the perimeter around a base in Bagram, around a base in Syria, nobody would even say anything about it. We have 4,000 troops on the border right now, and as a result of that mission, they need to secure those areas where they're patrolling.
Talk about military constructions. Do you know how many times military construction has been invoked as a national emergency?
That one was in
twice.
Right.
Twice. Once by George H.W. Bush during the middle of the Gulf War, and the second time by George W. Bush right after 9/11.
Chris,
this is hardly comparable to either of those.
Can you name one foreign threat in the world today, outside this country's borders, that currently kills more Americans than the threats crossing our southern border?
You know, the joy of this is I get to ask you questions. You don't get to ask
me. The answer is no.
But then answer my question. Can you name one case where a president has asked Congress for money, Congress has refused, and the president has then invoked national powers to get the money anyway?
Well, this current situation...
Just yes or no, sir?
The current situation pertains specifically to the Military Construction Authority.
I'm just asking, has there been a single case where Congress asked for money for military construction, Congress said no, and then...
The meaning of the statute, Chris, is clear on its own terms. If you don't like the statute, or members of Congress don't like the statute...
Would you agree the answer is no? There hasn't been a single case like this.
But the premise of your question is also false, because Congress has appropriated money for construction of border barriers consistently. This is part of a national security mission.
But it has never done this under a national emergency where President...
We've declared national emergencies to promote democracy in Belarus, to promote democracy in Zimbabwe.
But it didn't involve taking money that Congress refused to appropriate.
They didn't refuse to appropriate it. They passed a law specifically saying the president could have this authority. It's in the plain statute. That's a decision that Congress made. And if people don't like that, they can address it.
If the president gets access to the entire $8 billion he's seeking, how many miles of barrier will he be able to build, and how quickly?
Well, if you look at the authorities we have, both in terms of drug corridor funds, in terms of national emergency funds, in terms of Treasury funds, as well as appropriated funds, and other reprogramming authorities that may exist, in combination with the existing outlays,
I'm just asking a question.
You're looking at hundreds of miles collectively.
And how soon?
Well, you're going to see probably a couple hundred miles in time I would say, by the end of the next appropriation cycle. Altogether, in terms of what we already have underway, what's underway right now, and then what we're going to complete.
So by the end of this year,
by the end of,
hundreds of miles?
Next fiscal year, one more after this.
Okay, so by September of 2020, right in the middle of the presidential campaign.
Susan Page, anybody put in that position would have a very difficult time actually coming up with an alternative set of facts that weren't laughable on their face. But Stephen Miller failed on that as well. And it seemed that Chris Wallace just couldn't get him to answer the questions.
But kudos to Chris Wallace for that kind of persistent pursuit and challenging Stephen Miller with facts about particularly the history of use of these declarations of national emergency. This is going to be one more test, I think, for Republicans on the Hill. We do expect to see a resolution of disapproval. We think it'll pass the House. Don't need Republicans here. You do need a couple Republicans in the Senate to cross over if that's going to pass. We've had a half dozen Republican senators express concern about this on constitutional grounds and on other grounds. And will they stand up when it comes to a vote? Because in the history of the past 2 years is they've been really reluctant they've sometimes been willing to challenge the president rhetorically, but not to stand up when it comes to a vote.
Right.
I think this will be one more test of where we stand, where the president stands with officials from his own party.
Well, Joe, one member of the Senate who will definitely not be standing up to the president is Lindsey Graham. Take a look.
There's about $3.6 billion of it that could come from military construction efforts, including construction of a middle school in Kentucky, housing for military families, improvements for bases like Camp Pendleton and Hanscom Air Force Base. Aren't you concerned that some of these projects that were part of legislation that you helped approve in Congress are now going to possibly be cut out?
Well, the president will have to make a decision where to get the money. Let's just say for a moment that he took some money out of the military construction budget. I would say it's better for the middle school kids in Kentucky to have a secure border. We'll get them the school they need, but right now we got a national emergency on our hands.
It's
just beyond.
It's beyond. I mean, you know, Lindsey Graham actually over the past 2 months, he's shown. I've known the guy since '94. He's shown his worst traits. He is constantly unmoored, whether it's intellectually. He can go from being a conservative to a moderate liberal. He's all over the place. He's a John McCain maverick. He calls Donald Trump during the campaign. He says that he's mentally unbalanced. He says that Republicans will destroy themselves if they elect Donald Trump, and they will deserve to be destroyed. He stands by John McCain. John McCain passes, and then he stands with a man who mocks and ridicules John McCain and still mocks and ridicules John McCain.
Nothing.
I would ask, who is this Lindsey Graham? But unfortunately, it's the same Lindsey Graham that's been flipping and flopping like a mullet in the interstate mullet toss at Floribama contest for years now. He just flips and flops and flips and flops. And Sam Stein, to declare a national emergency, as Lindsey Graham just did, or to say, he's right, we've got a national emergency, when I will say again what we say every day. Donald Trump's 3 arguments are just specious. No national emergency because we have the lowest number of illegal crossings in half a century, in 50 years, since Lindsey Graham was in grade school, right? Drugs, we keep hearing drugs are pouring over the border. As we say, and as Chris Wallace said, 80 to 90% of those drugs come through legal ports of entry. There is absolutely nothing that Stephen Miller and Donald Trump can do to change those statistics, which comes from their government. And finally, crimes. Crimes are committed by a much higher percentage of people who were native-born, like Stephen Miller and Lindsey Graham, than from immigrants coming to the United States. Uncontrovertible, and again, from Donald Trump's own administration, their statistics.
Yeah. Joe, did you say a mullet toss in Alabama? I couldn't understand that.
It's
What
hard
was
to keep
that?
up.
Well, you have you have the
I just want to
Please don't
clarify that
explain
part
it.
first before
Sam.
we
You
get-
have what's called an interstate mullet toss every year at the Floribama. And there's a technique. You fold the mullets, and then you see who can throw them the furthest from the
It's
Florida
not the
line
mullet that you wore in high
into
school,
Alabama.
Sam.
Yeah.
Right, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
We should build a wall around that, I think.
Okay.
So to your point, yeah, there's a lot of misdirection here. Obviously, we do not have an emergency.
Now, by
on the
misdirection,
southern border.
by
lies.
misdirection,
They're
you mean
lies.
lying?
That.
Yeah, let's just
they're
call it
lies.
lying.
And
Okay.
then, but secondly, to see Trump get up there and say, I didn't have to do this right now, just undermines the entirety of the emergency argument. Of course, that might not have as much legal problems as people are saying, but politically, it's a disastrous admission. But I think the bigger story that we're sort of getting at here is just the acquiescence of Republicans in Congress, not just Lindsey Graham, which we've touched upon here, but Mitch McConnell, who has proclaimed himself to be an institutionalist, was the one who announced this deal and then announced his support for an emergency declaration. What Congress is essentially doing here, or at least Republicans in Congress are doing here, they're saying what the appropriations process that we hold so dear, which gives us so much power as a co-equal branch of government, we are going to cede at least a portion of that to the president. And they're essentially just taking away their own authorities, and for no other reason other than they're scared that the president might hurt them in a primary challenge. And so this is problematic for the Republican Party now, but it's going to be problematic down the road, I think, because the next time a Democrat is president, there's a precedent that they can look to and say, you know what, you declared it for a non-existent national emergency at the southern border. Well, look, climate change actually is causing huge amount of catastrophe and problems. Gun violence has caused tens of thousands of deaths. We really do have national emergencies here, and you have no standing to say that I can't evoke these charters anymore. And that's going to be a problem down the road for Republicans.
Eddie, you have Republicans that are concerned about Donald Trump in the primary. Of course, they should look back to see what happened in November of 2018, to see how that worked out for him. Mm-hmm. The worst loss in terms of lost seats since 1974, the worst popular vote loss in the history of this republic. And I'm just curious, Lindsey Graham's feeling awfully good about that border wall, a fake emergency, saying that kids in Mitch McConnell's state don't need money for schools, that they should use this money on a phony wall that Mitch McConnell, when he was in charge for 2 years, along with Paul Ryan, didn't spend a dime on because they knew it was a stupid idea. I understand Mitch may be scared of being primaried by Matt Bevin or somebody else. I wonder how general election voters in the state of Kentucky are going to feel about Mitch McConnell taking money away, as Lindsey Graham said. Mitch McConnell taking money away from schools in Kentucky for this imaginary phony wall that he could have funded himself when he and Paul Ryan were in power for 2 years.
You know, Joe, I think you're absolutely right in this regard. I'm not sure what the political calculus is, what's driving the fear. It's probably around being primaried, but I don't think they're looking towards the general election. But you've interviewed on this show the authors of How Democracies Die. And one of the claims of that book isn't just simply about the autocrat or the figure who emerges, who comes and undermines norms. It's about the complicity of elites, political elites, in allowing for those norms and those institutions to be eroded. And so what we see here in this crisis, in interesting sorts of ways, is the leadership of the Republican Party and even those backbenchers supporting Trump's old constitutional overreach. And in this way, I think this is really important for us to say. What we're seeing here is the imperial presidency gone amok. Many of us have been complaining over the years about the expansion of executive power. We wondered and we worried that if you had a person who occupied the office, who had no ethical backbone, who wasn't committed to constitutional principles, what they would do if they had access to that kind of power. And now we're here. And so what we have is a president who's pursuing a policy that's basically racist, in my view, who's engaged in a constitutional overreach in order to pursue that racist policy. And we have elites in Congress, particularly the Republican Party, who are signing off on it. We are in deep trouble, Joe.
So within all this, we're going to try and figure out what happens next. Also still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll show you those awkward moments from Mike Pence and Ivanka Trump. Plus, to hear Andrew McCabe tell it, when the president was placed between American intel and Russia's president, Trump said, quote, "I don't care. I believe Putin."
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.